1. A new way of thinking. Gender is, according to most, the behaviour and identity associated with being male or female. This, 99% of the time, corresponds with what someone was assigned to at birth, and so the realisation that I belong outside of this assumption is continuing to be a journey of self-discovery. To show my own identity, and to further your knowledge on a subject that is not talked about much, here's some definitions. Cisgender, the 99%, your gender matches your genitalia. Non-binary, gender identities which lie outside the norm of being male or female, which is what I personally identify with. When I came out, a lot of people didn't understand, so I made this graph to explain. The idea that gender belongs strictly within the bounds of 1, male, or 2, female, is outdated. It's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly gendery identity-ness. Gender is a social construct, and roles are not fixed from birth. In an ideal world, gender roles would be like they are in nature, which is mostly non-existent. But it's not true, so I like to think of gender as more of a sliding scale, with most people gathered at either end. But this majority doesn't make this middle section any less valid. Gender can also be fluid, and though it is unusual, some may feel themselves crossing vast areas of the spectrum. This concept as a whole is a very modern idea, so for transgender people it can offer confusing and conflicting feelings to their identity. Part 2. Perceptions and negativity. A big part of gender lies within your outward appearance, including hair, clothes, way of speech, etc. These ideas manifest themselves in society through set messages about what feminine and masculine are. These are where stereotypes like camp come from, or in my case slurs such as dyke and queer, which are inaccurate labels based on an assumption of sexuality, which is of course unrelated to gender. To put it another way, my wish to be male-bodied is unrelated to my interest or disinterest in vaginas, which is a pretty obvious concept really. My discomfort within my own body can even be met with disgust, as getting surgery or hormones is a controversial subject. This rejection and inability to communicate how I feel leads to a sense of separation from mainstream culture. But being between 2 points can also be seen as a lack of decision, which has the implication that being genderqueer is a phase, the disapproval of which mostly manifests itself in the refusal to use my chosen name over my birth name. Part 3. The future. The future is a scary thing, but thankfully the world is becoming more liberal and accepting. However, I doubt there will be a world where transgender individuals are completely equal to those who are cisgender. This is the same for similar issues of sexism, racism, and homophobia. Prejudice and traditional values will always be a barrier when tackling new issues, so I have to be accepting and patient in the face of ignorant views. The key to a change of attitudes lies in education. When I felt like my identity lay outside the norm, I was forced to research online because I wasn't told about transgender issues and representation when I was younger. A common argument against education is that it's less than 1%, why do we need to tell our children about something that doesn't affect them? Because 1% of the UK's population, using the 2011 census information, is still 631,817 people. And that's a huge chunk of people who deserve the same recognition and social acceptance rights as everyone else. Part 4. Coping and self-acceptance. I've been part of online communities for a long time, and so I turned to my open-minded online friendships for help. The support I received from the newly discovered trans community was also really encouraging. But unfortunately, having friends online and speaking to people I don't know on the internet has gained negative connotations of paedophilia, grooming, and pretending to be someone else. Communities focused on a social issue also sometimes seem to be quite elitist from an outsider's perspective. In my experience, all of these perceptions have been wrong because it's simply not in the interest of paedophiles or supremacist pressure groups to selflessly give advice to struggling transgender teenagers. Although I am more introverted than most people and do enjoy the time I spend online, this is not the only coping method I have. I see a counsellor to assist with depression and anxieties that may come with my identity, but again this carries very negative connotations. I've even been asked if I have a mental illness. These negative perceptions of my path to self-acceptance can be very damaging to my self-esteem. Part 5. Media representation. There has been an interesting trend with transgender issues in the media. With FTM individuals, there are a few young, female-bodied characters who are going through the process of becoming a boy, though this is still quite rare. Whereas, MTF characters are rarely played by male-bodied actors, and they are more commonly women who used to be men, which is usually used for comic effect. This humour and queer misrepresentation is most likely due to an underlying fear in society of effeminate men. There are of course exceptions to this rule, but the trope is quite clear. When positively representing, There are unbreakable ties to the gay community, further confusing the boundaries between gender and sexualities. However, the initialism of LGBT can be an empowered community in its own right because they both deal with the same kind of ignorance. There is also a narrower view of trans people than is a true reflection, which is the previously mentioned two-tone system of MTF and FTM. The truth is that the word trans covers a huge range of identities, which the heteronormative producers of the media simply do not acknowledge. This leaves the whole process of explanation to the individuals, which can feel like a greater pressure on top of self-realization and self-acceptance. In other words, it is ultimately easier to say the universally understood phrase of "I'm gay" than the less common but equally valid proclamation of "I'm a non-binary pansexual," which is arguably the fault of the lack of education and media. Part 6. A defined ending. Discovering my own identity and speaking about my experience has ultimately been a positive journey, despite difficulties. All trans people go through some kind of a journey, which can span many years, and comparatively I am only starting my own, and living in a privileged, middle-class, and reasonably liberal upbringing certainly makes the process easier than it could potentially be. And while it is true to some extent that I change my outward appearance to consciously conform or rebel, I would say the overwhelming reason for presenting as male, or at least a masculine female, is because it is how I feel most comfortable and it gives me personal satisfaction and happiness. The truth is that I will most likely always feel a separation from my ideal self because of the body I was born into and socialized as. My gender is complicated, and though I don't know if or when it's going to change, I think that's okay.